Okay, guys, we are back. Welcome back to our Fish the Moment live stream. Tonight, my goal is to convince Randy to give up shallow water fishing and become an offshore angler. Don't know how well that's going to go, but we're going to talk about what it would take for Randy to ditch the bank and live offshore, trying to catch his fish off the bank. I think it'll be an interesting episode. Hopefully, you guys will learn something about how I would go about trying to transition someone who is a shallow water expert into an offshore angler. And then probably next week we'll maybe flip it around. Randy will try to convince me to abandon the offshore game and go up shallow. So it should be a couple fun live streams here. Randy, how's it going tonight? How are you feeling about this topic?
Doing good, Johnny. Man, I don't know about that. It's just, you beat me so bad last summer in our challenges offshore that, it's probably not going to take much to convince me that I need to be offshore. But as far as actually doing it and getting that flipping stick out of my hand, it could be a little bit more challenging than that. Because, man, I just love getting in that shallow water and catching them.
Well, it's definitely a mentality change, and we'll kind of get into what are the things that make someone a good shallow water fisherman versus an offshore fisherman. What mentality shifts Randy would have to make, skills he would have to develop, all these different things to make that change, and also if it's worth it. I want to talk about a little bit about the time investment you would need to make that happen, the equipment you might need to get to make that happen. There's a lot of things that go into it, and I'm sure a lot of you guys out there have been thinking about trying to fish more away from the bank. And when we talk about offshore fishing, we're not talking about like going fishing in the ocean. We're talking about going in a lake and fishing away from the shoreline, out in the middle of the lake where you can't see any visible targets. And when you try to do that, it's daunting for a lot of guys, very intimidating. But you might watch guys on the Bassmaster Elite Series, watch YouTube videos, whatever, and you see them just absolutely crushing them offshore, catching a ton of fish, and it seems like if you could figure it out, it's the thing to do. And there's definitely times when it's great, as Randy mentioned. Sometimes if I can figure them out in our challenges, it can get pretty ugly, but it's also not the easiest thing in the world. So we're going to break it all down. But before we do that, just want to say hi to everyone on the stream. Got Jesse, Colby, Timo, Darren, Alan, Eric, John, Jacob. Good to see everyone in here. I saw a funny comment here, Randy. Let me read this here. He said, let me find this. This was a really good one. It was from Brent. He said, told the wife I had my college fishing class tonight.
Yeah, that's true.
That's a good deal.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get to it and start talking about Randy. So first up, my first question to you is, Randy, why aren't you fishing offshore right now? Like, obviously you fish tournaments, you fish the opens, and you choose to go fish up shallow in your tournaments. Why do you choose to do that versus trying to be versatile and go do some offshore, some shallow, like do a little bit of both?
Yeah, I'll sort of, in order to answer that question, Johnny, I've got to go back in time and sort of lead you to where we got to right now. But believe it or not, guys, I was like a pioneer in offshore fishing around this part of the country. And I'll tell you how it happened. I grew up fishing Grand Lake my whole life, fished it forever. And back in the early 90s, this has been like 1990, 1991. This is back when David Fritz was starting to really dominate fishing offshore cranking. And this is back when you had flashers, paper map, compass, that type of stuff. And he was a master at triangulating offshore structure, and he dominated. I mean, he won Angler of the Year, I think, a couple times, Bass Angler of the Year. That won the Classic. And so that was sort of on the horizon, but nobody really could figure out how to do it. I was riding down Grand Lake, down the middle of the lake in Horse Creek about 35 years ago, and I had a flasher, and I was headed back in the creek to flip some willows in the back of this bay. And I was in the middle of the lake, and all of a sudden I'm looking at my depth finder, and it was about 13 or 14 feet. And then all of a sudden it dropped off just real quick, just boom, boom, like that. And I'm like, what the heck was that? I couldn't figure out what had just happened. And this was back before, we had topo maps, but there wasn't any detail on the topo maps. It was like there was nothing on the topo map that showed anything. So I idled back, I shut the boat down, I idled back around, and I went back and forth, and I finally found this. It was a little bitty drop off where the water went from like 12 feet deep down to 16 feet. real sharp, and it was small. It was only like maybe 30 foot wide. And so anyway, I dropped a marker buoy down there and picked up a deep diving crankbait, and it was every cast a giant. It's like I sat there for I don't know how many 20-pound bags that I was just fun fishing that I culled. There was a gigantic school of bass on this piece of cover out there. And so for the next couple of years, I won about every tournament that was down there in the summertime of the year, buddy tournaments. I won some of the big bass tournaments, and I expanded it all over the lake. Nobody was doing it. So I would just idle around with my flasher and my map, and I would look at the bank contours visually, and then I would get out there and I'd graph it with my flasher, throw out marker buoys, and I had a bunch of offshore spots. So I sort of got the reputation for 2 or 3 years of being this Johnny Schultz Jr. offshore guru back before anyone else was doing it. But what happened is GPS came out shortly after that, like 3 or 4 years after that. And as soon as GPS came out, I had all these areas that I had to myself immediately got covered up. People were seeing me out on these spots. They'd go investigate in it. More people saw me out there. GPS came out, improved mapping came out, and people started finding all this stuff. What happened at that point, getting back to your initial question, is why I don't do it now, is that there became a race. It's like all of a sudden this offshore technology, this offshore way of fishing, it accelerated at just a lightning pace. And on top of that, the electronic technology was keeping up with that same pace as the angler knowledge. And every year it got more difficult to find those spots that other people weren't fishing. It got more difficult to afford the technology. You got one piece of equipment, the next year they came out with something else that made it obsolete. And to answer your question, Johnny, I just got tired of the rat race. I got tired of there being somebody on these spots that I had to myself for years. I got tired of buying an electronic unit and it's obsolete the next year, and then that just got me fishing back to the bank more. So it was really odd that I sort of developed a lot of this stuff around this part of the country, and then I got left behind on it because I didn't keep up with the technology. So that's sort of that's why we're at where we are now.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Now, I'm just going to share my screen a little bit, guys, to show you what Randy's talking about. Here's an area. I'm just kind of over by the Sailboat Bridge area here on Grand Lake, Randy, because I know that's an area you probably were spending some time in. And what Randy's talking about is like now you can go onto the Navionics web app on the internet for free and get a super detailed contour line map of all these areas on Grand Lake where you have these drop-offs. These are all the areas Randy was talking about where you have a drop from 11 feet of water to 30 feet of water. This is the stuff that Randy was finding with his flasher back in the day, and now you can just clearly see it. If you understand how to read a contour map, it's super easy to find. If you don't know how to read a contour map, just head over to the main Fish the Moment YouTube channel. I just made a video explaining every single type of structure on a contour map, explaining where to find ledges, humps, points. So go to the main Fish the Moment channel. I have a video there covering that for you. But basically, what Randy's talking about is that you used to be able to go to these spots, and they were completely unmolested by anybody. You could literally go and find these areas out in the middle of nowhere, and those fish were so easy to catch because no one was fishing them. Well, now, because guys have the electronics, they have the ability to find them, look for them, all that stuff, all the obvious areas, all the easy schools of fish to catch are completely covered up, and they're hard to get those fish to bite. And honestly, what happens is that the fish offshore are just as pressured as the fish up shallow, but the only problem with that is that the fish offshore are a lot harder to find at times than the fish up shallow, or at least maybe not harder to find, but they take more of a time investment. And I know one thing that we've talked about a lot, Randy, with the shallow water fishing is that you are now an expert at bait selection. You can go and find these fish up shallow. You can use a unique bait, a different bait modification with your jig or whatever it is, a lighter weight, a different crankbait, and you can trigger fish to bite even in these highly pressured areas. And the same thing happens offshore. And really the advantage I had growing up is that I was getting into the offshore game right when it was kind of hitting its, like, the peak of its, like, acceleration, where it was like the knowledge wasn't quite out there to everyone. I could still find a lot of good spots on contour maps and still catch the fish, but it was getting to the point where people were starting to figure it out. It wasn't as much of a secret anymore, and I had to start employing unique baits, unique retrieves, approaches. I had to better understand all these offshore areas using bass behavior, using my electronics to catch fish on areas that were receiving a lot of pressure. And I think that's probably what happened with you, Randy, is you were seeing all these guys fishing these spots, and you couldn't just pick up a crankbait, throw down there, and catch him. But if you maybe back in the day had a hair jig or had a drop shot or something, you could have gone to those same spots and wrecked them right behind those guys with a different approach, maybe using a different casting angle. But back then you probably hadn't really had that figured out. So that's how the offshore game has changed so much, guys, is that there's so much more detail to it, and you have to have so many different skills to make it work. Does that sound about right to you, Randy?
Yeah, definitely. And the thing that soured me on it is that spot I was telling you about that I won all the big bass, like the big bass derby awards and all, a bunch of tournaments. Is that last year that we had, the Grand Lake had one of those big bass bashes, and I won one day I won the hourly award, like, I don't know, 4 or 5 out of the 8 hours on this one spot. And a couple boats saw me fishing it because it's out in the middle of nowhere. And anyway, the next year when I came back to that spot, somebody had brushed it all up. They put brush all over it. They'd found it and they ruined it. And I haven't had a bite there since then, since they, got on that particular spot. But you're right. I mean, it's not, back then when I found those spots, those were hard structure spots. They were hard structures. They were like hard breaks. They were point ends and sides that broke off. They were ledges. And what has happened from what I've seen is those hard structure spots aren't as key as they're not as key now as they were back 30 years ago. Now it's more subtle. It's a brush pile off to the side here. It's finding a little group of suspended fish there. It's something a lot more subtle offshore. And I know that, you know what I'm talking about, Johnny, because you're sort of a master at finding those subtle, inobvious type offshore places. But anymore, I mean, if you got a hard break, if you got a creek channel intersection, that's just as obvious as a main lake point right now. So,
yep.
But, and another thing with that, we're talking about, we get a little bit back as far as the shallow water mastery about it, is one of the things that really sort of gives me confidence in the direction I'm headed is okay, is that, I just got done qualifying for the Toyota Series Championship. I finished 16th in the points. I didn't use anything but 2D sonar. I didn't even have my front side imaging or down imaging hooked up. I think I'm the only one that qualified for the championship that didn't have a live scope on the boat. So you can still compete at the top levels and do good, with even a flasher. I could have finished 16th in the points with the flasher. It wouldn't have made any difference.
Yeah, I think that's definitely telling of your confidence in that as well. And I think honestly, Randy, it's you made that decision to learn the shallow water game. And I know in the last tournament on Lake Dardanelle that you did really well in. You had the fish on to finish in the top 5 in that tournament. Had some fish jump off, stuff like that. But you were using a unique bait that no one else was throwing in that area, and you were going right behind in the biggest community hole in the entire area on Lake Dardanelle, and you were able to go right behind people and catch fish all day long with your technique, with your approach. And that's one thing that I do also offshore. And if I just kind of pull up my screen again here, guys, I'll just give you an example. I'll show you a couple areas, kind of what Randy was doing. Randy would catch a lot of fish on Lake Dardanelle this past tournament on these highway bridges right here. These are the most iconic, classic community holes in Lake Dardanelle. Everyone knows when there's a lot of current flowing, you can just go fish these bridges. You said you probably had like 30, 40, 50 boats fishing these areas right behind you, right, Randy? Like they were just going.
Yeah, it was
crazy.
Ridiculous. Yeah.
So they were all.
You told me before the tournament to get ready because it was going to be like that, and it was, man.
Yep. So it's like that's how you were able to figure that out. Well, the same thing happens offshore, and this was even happening back in like a tournament. I won a college regional championship in 2013. This is almost 10 years ago now, Randy. And I was fishing on Lake Dardanelle, and I'd found this spot. It's a pretty obvious spot now. People would think it's pretty obvious. But there was a ledge out here that had a bunch of fish on it. And it's a very obvious main river ledge, but there was a little shell bed just off to the side here that I knew about that no one else knew about. But also, these fish were setting up on this ledge, and I've caught some fish the weekend before in a tournament there, finished second place by myself in a team tournament against all the local sticks, and I lost by like just barely. I think I lost by like 2 ounces over the top 2 best guys in the lake, and then they were fishing as a team. I was fishing by myself, so I was just like a few ounces behind them. I came back and won the college tournament. Well, one of the guys, the brothers of one of the guys who was in the tournament, was fishing that tournament, saw me here, and the first morning of the tournament, his brother was sitting right on this spot. I guarantee you they'd never fished there before in their life, or they hadn't fished there that whole year, if anything, because I was the only one out there fishing that stuff. And then because, I was there, they went and they were fishing it. Well, what I figured out was that on this day, on this tournament, the current was getting pulled at 11 o'clock every single day. And at 11 o'clock, this area would turn on, and there was a little tiny shell bed over here where I could pull up and catch fish when that current was flowing that no one else was fishing. And because, it was funny because that one guy, he was a local also out there, he fished the spot all morning, never got a bite. Then 7 or 8 other college boats pulled up there and started fishing it because they saw this guy who's a local fishing it. So all these guys were fishing this area, and no one had fished there for like 3 months. I've been on the lake quite a bit. And then I basically pulled in through here and was fishing a small, subtle spot at the right time, and I caught like 15 pounds, 16 pounds here, and I rolled around to another community hole that is a super easy to find little road bed that drops into here that had like 40 boats fish it throughout that day because it's just a very big community hole. I pulled up behind all those guys after probably 30 boats had fished it and threw a hair jig down there, which is back in 2013, that was not a common bait to find. And I caught 2 4-pounders back to back off of this edge, this road bed, using unique bait. So it was my strategy and my execution that allowed me to get the win in that tournament. And that's something that happens nowadays even more. You have to really dial in your bait, your retrieve, these feeding windows. And it's the same thing that happens up shallow, Randy, honestly. And the reason that I feel like the offshore anglers or offshore fishing is tougher now than ever is that the advantage that anglers used to have when they were fishing offshore is that they could find an area, a hole, that was just good all the time. And they could pull up here and catch fish off this hole, this one like secret spot. Like you have these secret spots out in the middle of the lake. That's not how it works anymore with the offshore fishing. Instead, a lot of times I'm running offshore patterns. I find little groups of fish setting up on different patterns. So for example, on Table Rock Lake, I was out there the other day. Now I was catching a bunch of fish on very obvious points. They're basically these channel swing points where you have the creek channel swinging in and there's these long flat points. Super obvious stuff. But in these areas, there were groups of fish, and you would basically pull up there and you catch 1 fish per spot. And I would be throw like a hair jig or a little swim bait, and I could get 1 or 2 fish to fire. Then I would roll to another one, and I would duplicate that pattern. And I would find those fish with my electronics, catch a fish or 2, and move on, because there was a lot of pressure on these spots. A lot of guys have been fishing these spots. I've shown these spots in videos, which doesn't help at all. But catching fish in these areas, but I was having to kind of bounce around, make a pattern with it, and that might be the exact same thing you do, Randy, when you pull up in the spring and start going back in some of these creeks and fishing some 45-degree banks with a wiggle wart or dragging a shaky head on secondary points up shallow. It's the same mentality, it's just I'm using my electronics to do it, building these patterns. And the only difference between the way that you fish, Randy, and the way that I fish is that I need to use my electronics to see what's on the bottom of the lake out here, because if we look at this, and I just pull up Google Earth here, the areas I'm fishing on like Table Rock or out on Lake Dardanelle, they're out here in the middle of nowhere. So let me just pull up Google Earth just really fast to show you guys like what I'm talking about. If I pull up Google Earth, get rid of this. There we go. So like the areas I'm catching fish on, guys, on Table Rock might be out here randomly in the middle of like 20 feet of water. And I'm using my electronics to find groupings of 10, 15 fish. And then I might have to find 10 of those throughout the day to put together a decent bag of fish. And I have to do that within one fishing day. And I've developed the skills to be able to do that. And I'm actually going to be making a video here pretty soon explaining how long it takes me to find these offshore areas and how my process for finding them. That video is coming out on the main Fish the Moment channel this Friday. And so once I've kind of get my pattern developed and kind of find these fish with the electronics, I'm doing the same thing that Randy might be doing by going into one of these creeks in the spring and fishing all the secondary points and throwing a jerkbait on secondary points. except for I'm just doing it with my electronics. He still has to dial in the bait, just like I have to dial in the bait. Everything is pretty much identical other than the need to use the electronics, but the knowledge needed for both is completely different. The knowledge, I feel like, for understanding a lot of those shallow fish, the behavior of those shallow fish is very, very different than schools of offshore fish. And it's almost like you have to relearn how bass behave to catch fish in both scenarios. Would you agree with all that, Randy?
Yeah, absolutely. And it gets back to commitment again. And I'll use a prime example right now. Let's take Bull Shoals Lake, for example. Bull Shoals is really high. It's about 20 foot over normal right now. And if Jonny and I went there right now and did an on the water challenge, I would be up flipping those deep bushes, deep trees, and Jonny, I have no doubt he'd be trying to catch them out off the bank on the old shoreline probably. And both techniques could work, but both techniques require a full-time commitment to it. Mm-hmm. Jonny can't go out there and just idle around for an hour and expect to maybe find a big group of fish. It may take him half a day. And it's the same with me. I may have to dial in like the fall rate, the color, the type of bush, everything that surrounds that in order to get dialed into that flip and bite. And he may have the same type of deal as far as on bank angle, how deep the fish are suspended, how they're positioned on the structure. So getting back to the original gist of the entire show like that is if you want to make this transition and if you want to become a deep water angler, like if I wanted to transition that, it takes a complete, dedicated, disciplined approach that this is what you're going to do the whole time. And that's the only way you can be successful at it. That's the only way you can be successful if you commit to shallow water. It's the only way you can be successful if you commit to offshore fishing like Jonny does. You can't do both. I mean, I'm not saying it's impossible, but there's not one single angler out there that has emerged that has figured out how to make that adjustment immediately without any hesitation. They can analyze the conditions and say, hey, I need to be fishing shallow, I need to be fishing deep, and they have no prejudice or they have no bias or no favorite as far as which way they fish. But as of right now, everybody's got their favorite way they like to fish, and that's what they gravitate towards.
Yeah, like even guys like Jacob Wheeler, like Brandon Polnick, they are really, really good at both approaches, but it's not like they can just go into a tournament day and say, okay, I practiced for 3 days, I found some fish up shallow. Tournament day, I'm just going to flip the switch and just go start fishing offshore and then compete to win in the tournament. That doesn't happen because it takes so much time to understand how to find winning fish in both scenarios. And one thing that I find is very fascinating with the offshore fishing versus the shallow fishing is that the fish behavior is very, very different, guys. We talk about this in all of our seminars that we do over on fishingmoment.com. The bass behavior of shallow water bass versus offshore bass is so different at times that you can't understand what the fish are doing in each way just by fishing down the bank or fishing offshore. When I go fish up shallow, I have to completely change my mindset. I have to think I'm fishing for almost a completely different species of bass almost because they act so differently in so many ways. And that is one of the biggest challenges I see anglers facing when they try to make that switch is they're trying to relate what they do up shallow offshore. Another thing I hear a lot from guys that I think is one of the biggest misconceptions out there, and I actually had a comment here, not trying to pick on anyone, but basically I think someone says, where are you in the country? They're talking the live stream. They may not be offshore yet. That is one of the biggest misconceptions I think I've ever heard from people is they say they may not be offshore yet. What I can tell you is that there are always fish offshore. That is the way I've found it. Randy, we've done these shallow versus offshore challenges we did it for a pretty long period of time. There's always fish offshore. There's always fish up shallow. There may be like very few exceptions where you might be able to find that, but even if fish aren't offshore, for example, like I'll give you a great example, guys. I was fishing out on one of these the Arkansas River. It's a shallow, muddy fishery, Arkansas River. It's not what you would consider an offshore area. So we're going into one of these backwaters, and we're here in the middle of April. You would think that would be prime time, go in the backwaters, find fish back in these little coves and pockets, things like that. I mean, I'm talking like 6 inches of water visibility. Well, I was out here one year and we absolutely wrecked them in the mouth of one of these little pockets here on a shell bed in 3 feet of water on a sandbar. And that was in April. Current was ripping, and we were out 30, 40 yards from the bank fishing in 2 to 3 feet of water on a shell bed with a school of fish catching 3 and 4 and 5 pounders. And that's something that I just was looking for. I looked for the offshore fish, and it was the complete opposite of what you would ever expect to catch fish doing on the Arkansas River. Again, shallow, muddy waters, a bunch of grass laydowns, but you can find them offshore. There may not be many of them, but if you know what you're looking for, you can always find fish. Now, I know a lot of guys, there's people in the comments who are like, I miss traditional bass fishing. I love what Randy's doing. Like, I want to just go to the bank, pick up a jig or a crankbait and go fishing. And guys, if that's what you like to do, if you like to just not think about the electronics, not think about all the complicated stuff with fishing and just go fishing for fun, have at it. I'm not saying that you need to fish offshore, but there are guys who are interested in it, who are intrigued by it, and I just want to give you the confidence to know that you can catch fish offshore any day of the week on pretty much any lake in the country. There may be only 10%, 20% of the bass living offshore in a catchable location, but you can catch them pretty much anywhere in the country offshore on a given day. The definition of offshore might be they're in a flat that's in 3 feet of water, 100 yards from the bank. It might not mean that they're sitting in 25 feet of water. That's different. There's offshore fishing is, in my opinion, any time when you're more than a cast length away from the bank and there's no visible cover around. That is my definition of offshore fishing. So you can make offshore fishing work, but to do it, you need to learn the electronics, and honestly, you need to understand how the wolf packs and the schools of bass act offshore, which I talk about in a ton of my videos. If you go to the main Fish the Moment channel, I dedicate my entire channel to offshore fishing. I have videos on everything, and also if you guys are still interested in offshore fishing and don't know what I'm talking about, how to catch fish doing it, basically what you can do. One second here, I need to hide someone over here in the chat. I don't know what they're doing. Let me see here. We're just gonna remove that. Okay, cool. So if you guys are confused about what to do offshore, basically what you can do, head to the website fishthemoment.com, go to the learning plans page, and I have put together an offshore bass fishing learning plan with all the videos that are completely free that I've made for YouTube. I've spent over 1,000 hours making all these videos for free. You can literally go here and you have the sonar basics, side imaging, down imaging, how to graph, the whole process, offshore bass behavior, how it's different between shallow versus offshore, which baits to use offshore, other just interesting videos that help explain how to go about it. I mean, I have so many videos, so many things to look at. So that is available for free on fishthemoment.com. You can watch those videos and it will get you 75% of the way down the road to knowing what to do offshore. The rest is just time on the water. So that is kind of the deal there, Randy. I know it's kind of going on a rant, but what are your thoughts there?
Well, I think first of all, I've sort of got this self-imposed reputation that I don't like fishing deep water, but fishing deep water, if you've had success at it, it's super addictive. Because I remember this one tournament I won down at Grand Lake back in the mid-90s. It was like a Chamber of Commerce buddy tournament. I fished with a friend of mine, and we won the tournament by like 10 pounds. We had 27 pounds in that tournament. It was a June tournament. Caught every one of them on a DD22. And it was like I found these fish on the end of a long point that had a gradual taper from about 12 to 15 foot of water. And you threw that DD22 out there, and as soon as you hit bottom and started cranking it, your rod tip would load up with a 5-pounder. That is so addictive when you can pull up to an offshore spot and you can get on these big groups of big fish. I mean, I get it. I understand the attraction to that because it's a lot more work, putting together a 27-pound bag on the bank. I mean, if you're flipping willows, you're flipping laydowns, and you get 27 pounds together, you've worked your butt off. But offshore fishing, it can happen so quick. I mean, you can catch a giant bag of bass on consecutive casts, and that is so much more efficient if you can get it, if you can find those type of fish. But those type of days like that, I mean, it's so hit and miss because it's been my experience that deep fish will move a lot. They're a little bit more finicky. They use specific structures in very short windows of time. So it's sort of a feast or famine deal. And I've just always found more consistent success fishing shallow. But as far as if you told me, Randy, would you rather go in a tournament and try to win this tournament flipping a jig in flooded bushes, or if you can go out and catch them deep crank and find a big school of 5-pounders, which one would you go for? I'd take the offshore fish every single time, but there's something that happened in my fishing, I'm not sure what it was, that I just got pulled away from that. I mean, I got burned by it. I got tired of competing with everybody else that was trying to do it. You know, I got tired of the money it costs to do it. And I know that's one of the things that I think a lot of people, why they're attracted to what you're doing, Jonny, is because you've shown people that they don't have to have this huge financial investment to be successful fishing offshore. And I think that's pretty attractive to people.
For sure. And, you know, one thing you said there, Randy, I thought was interesting is that you have more confidence and more consistency to find fish. Like, you feel like you can more consistently catch fish up shallow. And for me, it's the complete opposite. I can much more consistently find fish offshore than catch fish up shallow. But just so you guys know, like, for the past 3 or 4 years, making YouTube videos, I've basically committed myself to just focus on offshore fishing and offshore instruction. When I was fishing tournaments back in college and before that, I was 50-50, offshore or shallow. I tried to be as versatile as possible. Then for YouTube, I realized there just wasn't a lot of good instruction offshore, so I focused exclusively offshore almost, or for 90% offshore. I can still catch them up shallow, but I have so much more confidence because I do it all the time. That's the thing with Randy. He's more confident going and developing shallow water patterns because that's what he does all the time. And that's the thing that is really important with the offshore fishing versus shallow. It's more about confidence and understanding how everything works because you've put time on the water doing it versus one being easier or better than the other. So I do want to kind of dig into that, Randy. I want to show you guys the equipment you need to get started offshore fishing, the mentality you need to have. If you really want to like sink your teeth into it and do it, I want to explain exactly what you need to do. Before we do that, we do want to take a quick break for a shameless plug for some of the stuff on our website. As you guys know, we don't have any sponsors for podcasts, nothing. We just support ourselves off of our website, fishmoment.com. And if you guys are interested in more information about bass fishing, more detailed instruction, in a kind of a more a more structured form in terms of really high quality information, graphics, slides, check out some of our upcoming virtual live seminars. One we have coming up is an advanced jig fishing seminar where we're going to be breaking down our best summer jig fishing techniques, both shallow and offshore. We're going to be giving you a ton of high quality graphics you can take to the lake and print off and actually take with you in a PDF form. We'll be sharing all the conditions, weather, water clarity, all the nitty gritty that you need to catch fish offshore and shallow in the summer on jigs. So check out that seminar. Another thing that you guys might be interested in is that we just posted all of the seminar recordings for our last few seminars. And I'm going to be updating this as we go through the next few weeks with some of our past seminars. And you can actually purchase the recordings. These are not live seminars. They are the pre-recorded basically, but it's 3 hours of instruction. And if you purchase this, you're going to get a really high quality seminar on all the topics mentioned here. You can check them out if you want more details. So definitely check those out. If you did miss these seminars, if you want to sign up, we'll be doing those going forward with the recordings. And then one more thing to check out if you guys are interested are our lake breakdowns. One thing that Randy's been working on really hard is putting out some summer lake breakdowns. We're knocking out as many as we can, and you basically get 40 GPS waypoints for lakes all across the country, and you can download those waypoints straight to your fish finder. So if you do have some trouble finding fish on your lake, definitely check out these waypoints. Randy's been busting his butt to get these going, so definitely check them out. They're definitely worth it. And if you don't have your lake available, you can always check out a personal lake breakdown from Randy. We have some available right now on the website. Normally they sell out really quick, but because we haven't really been doing videos for a bit, there's kind of a little bit of an opening. So if you have struggled to get a personal lake breakdown, go right now because normally they sell out within like an hour, but there's a couple available right now. So that's it for our little shameless plug there. Randy, anything else to say on that?
Yeah, the lake breakdowns we're starting to get out. I think we put out about our new summer ones, maybe 8 or 9 new summer lake map breakdowns on the. I'm not sure if they're loaded up now, but they will be here pretty quick. And if you guys have a lake that you fish, your home lake, or if you've got a lake that you're getting ready to go to for a tournament, These are just a great resource that give you a foundation to build upon, gives you some starting points, and sort of takes away the intimidation factor a little bit. So they're pretty cool, and we put a lot of work into them. It takes a lot of time to get them done.
For sure. Yeah, it's a really good resource, guys, especially if you're trying to get into bass fishing, trying to get a start. It will jumpstart your understanding of bass location, behavior. We have detailed area descriptions, everything like that. They'll really get you on the right foot. So let's jump into Randy. I want to start talking about what it takes to actually start offshore fishing. And there's a lot of different ways you can get into it. There's a lot of info out there already. One of the biggest misconceptions I hear from guys is that you have to have a high dollar fish finder, live scope, 360 imaging, and all this stuff to catch fish offshore, which is the furthest thing from the truth. And I know you talk about that a lot, Randy, and sometimes I'm like, man, Randy, you make it sound like you need to have $30,000 of electronics to compete. You can catch tons of fish offshore without all that stuff. And if you watch most of my YouTube videos, guys, I was actually running an old Humminbird Onyx unit or Humminbird 998 that was like 10 years old, 8 years old for the majority of my channel up to like 6 months ago. And all my recordings I use on my channel, a lot of them are still from that old Humminbird. And I go out with guys all the time for fishing lessons, and they have units, for example, like this Hook 5 or this Hook 7 from Lowrance. This is a $600 fish finder at the most. You can get the triple shot, you can get it with the mapping, but you can just get for $500 you can get a fish finder that gives you down imaging, side imaging, 2D sonar. I've even gone out with guys that have the Hook 5 and they just have the split shot, so they don't even have side imaging, don't even have side imaging, just down imaging and 2D sonar. This unit is $299, and I did a lesson last year, Randy, with a guy on Lake Washita, and I hadn't been to Lake Washita in like 3 years. So we went out in the lake, went fishing. He had this unit on the boat, and he's like, show me how to catch fish. And using this unit, I was able to quickly find us a school of bass suspended in some standing timber. We caught like 15 fish, and we went around the lake and patterned it and caught like 25 to 30 fish using a X split shot Lowrance $300 unit. Not because I had the fanciest equipment or anything on the boat. It's because when we went to Lake Washita, I understood not only how to read the fish finder, but I also understood to an extent where the fish should be setting up based on seasonal patterns, based on my experience on the water. I knew that fish were going to be moving out to secondary points. They were going to be setting up on some of these humps and these longer points. And I was able to go graph those with an inexpensive fish finder and find a ton of fish and catch a bunch of fish. Now, the reason I'm able to do that is not because of my equipment, it's because of the time I've spent on the water. I've spent probably, I would estimate 3,000 hours studying, implementing, and trying to learn offshore bass fishing over the past 10 years. And if you want to know how many hours 3,000 hours is in terms of days, if we divide that by 24, that means I've spent 125 days of my life just dedicated to offshore bass fishing. And that's probably a low ball. That's more like on the water, just learning, stuff like that. And that's like full days. So that's not just like, that's like 24-hour days. So that is kind of how I think about it. I've spent so many hours diving into bass behavior, understanding what's going on, so I can go out with a cheap fish finder and go catch tons of fish. I don't need live scope. I don't need anything like that. And you can still do that today. And I know you've seen me do that, Randy, on the lake. You've seen me go out with my old fish finders. You've been in the boat with me, and I've been able to catch tons of fish. So that's one thing I want to dispel right this minute is you don't need a ton of equipment. I mean, I run an 18-foot Triton that's a 2005 Triton. It's an old Triton. It's not like I have a brand new boat. I'm not running the craziest electronics. Even right now, I'm running a Humminbird Helix 9, a $1,000 fish finder, and I can find plenty of fish with just that. You don't need $10,000 worth of electronics. What you need to know, though, is how to actually use the electronics and interpret them, and that's what takes the time. It's not the money investment, I feel like, that's the biggest barrier for offshore fishing. It's the fact that you need to spend hours and days and months of time learning how to do it, just like anything. What are your thoughts, Randy?
Yeah, I remember up until just like 3 or 4 months ago, Johnny had like his electronics were like 7 or 8 years old that he had on his boat. I mean, these things were like antiques. And I think one of the big keys on this, Johnny, is that and not only do you know how to interpret and read the electronics, but I think it's very important to understand how to set your electronics up to get the right readings, because I know I just wasn't getting the definition even on my 2D, and you know told me some stuff about how to change the settings, and it really made a big difference. So I think one of the biggest areas of instruction that a lot of people need to learn is simply how to set their units up to maximize the detail of it. Because I think so many people, when they get a unit, they don't really know what they're doing as far as how they need to set it up, or they don't know what they're looking at, and they rely on the automatic settings. And you can get by with those automatic settings, but when you're talking about being able to discern like bait fish and fish next to structure and the subtle things that really separate people like yourself from just somebody that's actually just tries to catch them offshore, understanding how to set those units up is key. And I know that you got some videos out on that. I mean, they're well worth the time checking them out.
And this is kind of how I think about it, Randy, and I don't know if this is a good analogy, but like the way I think about it is that if, let's say you give someone, you put someone in an airplane and they have to go fly an airplane. You can't expect someone to be able to go fly in a small aircraft, just jump in one, fly across safely to a landing strip and go land somewhere. You're going to crash, you're going to hit something, nothing's going to go right there. You need to learn all the instruments, how to set everything, how to deal with the wind, the crosswinds. I don't know enough about flying, so I don't really even know. But like, if you think about guys who fly commercial planes, they have to put thousands of hours in flight training to be able to take anyone on a passenger to like be good enough to do it. That's how it's like with offshore fishing, where you have to learn the equipment, you have to learn all the other factors. You can't just jump into a boat with a fish finder and just start catching them offshore. You can luck into it a little bit here and there, which is always good to build your confidence. One thing about shallow water fishing is you can luck into fish a little bit easier. And that's what I call it. A lot of guys who catch fish up shallow, they are literally lucking into their fish. They're not intentionally catching fish by going from one spot to another, or they don't know why the fish are there. They just happen to pull up on a bank, cast out there, and they happen to get a bite just because you hit the fish in the face, basically. And I feel like with offshore fishing, it takes a lot more intentional understanding of what you're doing to catch those bass, because when I'm coming out here on a spot on Lake Washita, yeah, you could potentially, if the fish are active on a bank, you could roll down one of these banks with a jerk bait or an Alabama rig or a spinner bait and catch some fish, but it's a lot harder to catch fish off the tip of a point when they're on a spot the size of your boat, and you need to make sure you actually make the proper cast, you're using the right retrieve, you know the fish are there. You have to be intentional about it. You can't just luck into them. You can luck into them at times, but it's much harder to do that, especially when you're having a lot of guys who actually know what they're doing. So you have to put in that effort and that time to learn it. And I think just a lot of guys aren't willing to put in the time. And honestly, Randy, like for yourself, if you were going to become an offshore angler and like dedicate yourself to that, you probably would need to put in, I would expect, about 500 hours on the water with your electronics and just learning bass behavior in all your different lakes, on a TVA lake, on a highland reservoir, lowland reservoir. If you're going to go fish the tour, you have to put all this time learning where the fish set up, where they're positioned. Like, for example, we were talking on Pickwick when you were out there, and like a lot of guys were catching them offshore on Pickwick. And I was saying, hey, they're probably going to be on their first ledges where they pull off on shell beds and like 10 to 15 feet of water. Well, if I told you that, you probably still may have not been able to go out there and find those fish because very few guys found them, but that's how the tournament got won. And the reason they knew how to find them is because, one, they had the electronics, they understood where the bass behavior was, and I feel like if I was there, I probably could have found those fish relatively easily because I've done that on countless lakes around this area, versus you can tell someone, go fish ledges in 15 feet of water, and this is what to look for, but you still have to have all the knowledge accumulated to be able to put that into practice, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's hard to catch other people's fish, and I'll use an example here that I think a lot of guys can relate to. Let's talk about some of the experiences I had fishing bull shoals and table rock this past winter during those fish the moment on the water lessons. In the last winter, there was everybody out there. If you went to bull shoals or table rock, they were just out in the middle of the creeks, out in the middle of the lake, looking at live scope. They could have literally you could have put a tent around their boat where they couldn't have seen anything around them, and they would have caught just as many fish because they were completely focused on that live scope. And I was reading about guys saying they were catching them on, Rapala ice jigs and swim baits and that type of stuff. So I get out there and I said, well, I'm just going to idle around here and sort of see what I can see with my stuff, with my side imaging and down imaging and 2D. So I went out there, and there's a lot of there's a lot of submerged timber deep on Table Rock and Bull Shoals. So I'd get out there and I'd get over these trees, and the trees were everywhere out there. I could not discern what was a fish versus a tree limb, because when you're talking about trees that are in 40 to 60 foot of water, the limbs sometimes look like fish. So I'm looking at these things. I even put my reading glasses on. It's like, is that a fish or is that a limb? And I did this for like 30 minutes, and I messed around and I fished a little bit and couldn't catch anything, gave up on it. And then I'd go back to the bank and I'd start whacking them on a jerk bait, fishing in 5 foot of water. So when I know that I can go over there and catch good ones shallow on a jerk bait, I just don't have the confidence to stay out there and learn how to catch them out in that deep offshore, water that I can't really know what I'm looking at. And for me, that's one of the biggest things that I've had a problem with in my own deep water fishing is I haven't been able to interpret or see the same things that you're seeing, because Jonny will send me a screenshot, or if you guys have seen some of Jonny's seminars, he'll give a screenshot of some 2D sonar or side imaging, and it's like you can see these fish perfect the way that he's got his screenshot set up. It never looks that way on my screen. It's like I don't even know hardly what I'm looking at. And guys, you got to understand, I have done this full time for 35 years. I've spent thousands and thousands of hours on the water bass fishing. So it's not like I just fell off the tournament truck when it comes to catching bass. I know how to catch bass. But when it comes to fishing the way that Jonny and Jacob Wheeler and Thrift and Polinick does, man, there is a big disconnect between the average guy trying it and somebody that can master it.
For sure. And I just pulled an example you were talking here, Randy, about like some trees on Table Rock where it had a bunch of fish in them. And this is a grouping of trees where I found fish that took me 2 hours to graph. And I was discerning the fish from the limbs, and I found the schools. And this is a very obvious example. There's a lot less obvious examples. I know we went when I first got the live scope, Randy, and I was able to graph some trees, find like 4 or 5 fish, and then pull up and use the live scope to catch him. I know you're out there together, and you're like, how do you know what the tree versus the bass? And it's like, well, I've spent literally probably 200 hours graphing standing timber, fishing all the different trees that look like they have fish in them, and then not catching anything, and then determining, okay, these are the fish that have trees in them, and this is the one that's like, I had to compare. Like, I looked at the screen, I'm like, is that a fish? Cast in there, don't get bit. Cast in there, does that fish? Oh, I get bit. And I kind of like learn by just trial and error. And to put this shoe on the other foot, I don't want you guys to think that I feel like I'm just like the best fisherman in the world, because while I understand the offshore fishing, if you put me in the opposite situation where I'm over here on Table Rock Lake and you put me in the back of a creek, back in here. I remember I went out with Randy and we actually went to this exact section of Table Rock. And if you had put me in there, I would not have known what to do to catch a fish. Like, I had no idea where I needed to cast. I was like, well, I guess I could just go fish some riprap or go fish some isolated laydowns, like whatever. I don't know. I would just try to fish what's around, what's visible. And that might be what a lot of you guys do too. Just find a bank that looks kind of interesting, cast it the rocks and things, and maybe try to look at a contour map to see where a channel swung in or all this stuff. But Randy came back in here, hadn't been back in here in years, and was like, oh yeah, I need to go to this bank right here because this rock angle and the water clarity has this visibility, and there's a bird here, and there's 3 laydowns that are laid at this angle. Boom, 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 caught fish. Okay, let's leave. And I'm like, well, what about this bank? Or this bank, or this bank? He's like, nah, those aren't right. And then we roll over, and he's like, okay, let's go to this bank. And then boom, 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 we catch fish. And I'm like, how are you doing this? And he's like, I just know. I have a feeling about it. Like, that just, it's the right bank. It looks right. And I'm over here, I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. And when I go up shallow, I feel like there are a million targets and everything looks identical. And yes, I can catch fish up shallow, but half the time when I do it, I feel like I'm just running secondary points and just kind of praying that the fish bite. And like, yeah, I might get on a pattern that they're on secondary points, but like, I don't understand the shallow water intricacies with the water clarity, the right mix of rock, the right retrieve speed, all these things that are needed to get to trick these really tricky, sensitive, shallow bass. Where Randy, he spent his whole life perfecting that. Well, that's what I can do offshore with my electronics. I can pick out 12 fish out of one tree in a grouping of 1,000 trees, know that I need to pick this color swim bait with this weight head, with all those different things, because I've just been doing that for so long. The skill set is completely different. The approach is the same. Randy's just spent thousands, hundreds of thousands of hours at this point probably perfecting where those fish are in these shallow water scenarios, and he's done it through trial and error. And that's what I've done offshore. Most of the stuff I've learned, guys, I didn't have someone teaching me how to catch fish offshore. Like, no one taught me how to do all this. What I did is I literally graphed over an area, looked at the screen, said, is this a fish or is this not? The only way I'm going to tell is if I cast a bait in there. And then I would come back and I would fish that same spot 3 or 4 times, because maybe it was a timing deal. The wind needed to be blowing. The current needed to be going. And then I would go to that spot 4 times, and the 4th time I go there, the wind is blowing 20 miles an hour and I catch him. Or I throw this different bait and I catch him. And I just learn from a culmination of trial and error over and over again. And I try to share as much of that with you guys as I can on the channel. But at the end of the day, too, like Randy said, it's hard to catch other people's fish, because I have experience to teach me when I can make a small adjustment or a small change that will get me bit offshore, just like Randy can up shallow. So really, at the end of the day, the short answer to our question with this stream is, what would it take for Randy to become an offshore fisherman? It would probably take about, if you wanted to compete at the highest level, at the open level, stuff like that, it would probably take him about, I would estimate, 300 hours on the water, maybe 500 hours on the water, on a variety of lakes across all seasons. So he would have to figure out in spring, summer, fall, pre-spawn, post-spawn, fall transition, when there's a winter turnover, when the water's high, when the water's low, when the water's muddy, when the water's clear, rocky lakes, grassy lakes, timber lakes, fishing offshore in all those scenarios. Well, that's what I've been doing. I fish all these different lakes across all of Arkansas, different places, and I know how to catch fish in every season in every type of lake, because I've spent probably 30, 40, 50 hours on each condition learning it and figuring it out through trial and error. And Randy's done the same thing up shallow. It's all about time on the water. It's all about experience. It's not necessarily just because I can read a fish finder better than anyone else. It's a lot more than that.
Yeah, I would add to that awareness, Johnny, and because it's just like when you were with me up shallow, I was seeing things that you couldn't see, and when I fish deep with you, you can see things that I can't see. And I'll give you guys a good example here. Several years ago, I attended a series of wilderness survival schools in New Jersey. These were week-long schools, basically teaching you every element of survival that the Native Americans, passed on down. So anyway, I was out in the woods one day with one of the instructors, and this is when I first got to the class, and I didn't really know what I was doing. And we were walking through the woods, and to me, when I was looking at the vegetation and the trees, I didn't really know what I was seeing, but he was going through there and picking this and that. And by the time we got done with our walk, he had a handful of stuff, and he goes, and like 5 or 6 of the plants that he had picked there were edible, and 5 or 6 of them were medicinal. So he said, yeah, this plant right here is good for a headache or a toothache, or this will help you if you got swelling, and this is a good food to eat, during the winter time of the year. So he could see things that I simply could not see. And it's the same when you're trying to, be an expert at offshore or deep water fishing. It's all about awareness, and that awareness comes from time on the water. It's something that you can't really get taught. What Johnny's talking about, the 300 hours that it would take me to learn to fish offshore, it would probably even take longer than that if I tried to learn it in a bunch of different water scenarios and a bunch of different environments. If you stuck me on one lake, Lake Eufaula in Alabama, Bugs Island Lake, whatever, and you told me to learn how to fish this lake offshore, that period of time might be shorter, because you're going to have characteristics that are unique to that lake that you can isolate. But when you're trying to duplicate that offshore fishing in a variety of water temperatures, water clarities, water level, seasonal changes, environmental conditions that change on the lake, that throws a completely different wrench in there. And it's something that you never learn. I mean, this is something that's an ongoing, lifetime, classroom we're in. I mean, if Johnny's still idling around looking at his electronic unit with his reading glasses when he's 80 years old, he's still going to be learning, man. He's still not going to know it all.
Yep.
And so we're just all students out here, man, in the sport. None of us really know everything that we're talking about.
And that's a really great point, Randy. I really think that's something that a lot of guys should take out of this, is that from our perspective, for me, I like to learn how to catch offshore fish anywhere I go. So you could put me any lake in the country, and I could go find them offshore. That's my mentality. I do this for a living, so that's what I want to be able to do. That's what I strive for every single day. But for a guy who's just fishing local tournaments, and I'm just using here Lake Dardanelle for an example. I know that there's guys on Lake Dardanelle who are absolute sticks at catching fish offshore in certain seasons. So in the summertime, there's guys who can just absolutely crush them offshore out here in the summertime, and they know exactly where to go within all these areas, Illinois Bayou, Piney Bay, and they can catch them there. But then let's say in the pre-spawn, they don't necessarily fish offshore. They go and they fish up shallow in some backwaters or things like that, throw a chatterbait and a spinnerbait around. Well, they couldn't catch them offshore on Lake Dardanelle that time of year, but I can catch them offshore on Lake Dardanelle any season of the year, year-round, because that's what I learned to do. And I learned, regardless of the conditions, wherever, how to catch them offshore. But if you guys want to just learn offshore fishing, and you only fish, let's say, one lake or two lakes, you can actually learn just for one season how to catch fish offshore. So, for example, Lake Dardanelle. I know that on Lake Dardanelle, the best way to catch fish offshore is going to be either on a shell bed or on a brush pile in 6 to 12 foot of water, where the water has 1.5 to 3 foot of visibility. And that's just something that I've learned. I know where all the key little spots are, the key areas, and even if I don't have those spots, I could go graph and find areas, because I know on Lake Dardanelle, in the summer, if you have 1.5 to 3 foot of visibility, those fish are in brush or shells in 6 to 12 feet. And I catch them on a crankbait, a big worm, stuff like that. But I also know on Lake Dardanelle, in February, you can catch a bunch of fish on an Alabama rig and a flat side crankbait on rock and rocky areas like road beds, things that are in different areas of the lake that I'm not going to show because my friends in Lake Dardanelle will get mad at me. But you can catch them there in 3 to 8 feet of water offshore and crush them. Well, I've learned that because I've just spent a lot of time learning that, and the way I figured that out is I actually had to go to Lake Dardanelle and I fished all my summertime stuff with the brush and the shell in February, and I never got any bites. And so I'm like, well, why aren't the fish here? Well, they use those spots in the summer. That's all they do. But then coming into September, or coming into February, they set up on completely different things. And I had to relearn, and I had to basically learn through trial and error. I fished all the rocky spots. I fished in 2 feet, 10 feet, 15 feet, 20 feet. I tried everything until I figured it out. And now I can go back in Lake Dardanelle in the same conditions year after year after year and catch them. Same thing, for example, on like a Lake Washita. I know on Lake Washita, I can go in the wintertime and catch them out of this one grassy ditch that's right here, and I can catch them there every single year as long as the fish are kind of set up in that depth range. Whether if the water's high or low, it could be weird. But like if the water's normal and there's some grass or some timber in there, I can catch fish in this ditch. And I just learned that this spot and a few other spots in here hold fish offshore, and I can learn one specific lake to be good at that. But it doesn't mean because I can catch fish on this grassy ditch here in like Washita and catch 20 pounds in December, that doesn't mean that I'm going to be able to come over here in August and run to this part of the lake and go and find and catch fish. I can do that because I've done it and I've learned how to figure it out and adjust to the water clarity, all this stuff, and I don't have to know all the stuff about Lake Washita. I can generalize my knowledge, and that's the thing that Randy's really got at Up Shallow. He can take his combined experience on lakes all across the country, literally everywhere, and he's fished all over this country from the west coast to the east coast, and he has so much combined knowledge of shallow water fishing that if we throw him on a random lake, I'm just going to scroll in here, if we throw him onto a random little lake here, I have no idea what this lake is, but it could be this lake right here. We could throw him on this lake, and he's going to be able to figure out how to catch him up shallow using the knowledge from lakes in other regions, areas, his confidence techniques, because he's developed that over time. But if we throw an average angler out here, they might really struggle because they don't know they don't have that combined experience. So don't beat yourself up if you can't do that. And if you are just a local angler and you just have 1 or 2 lakes, learn that lake really well and maybe pick which technique you want to use in which season. Pick, do you want to be an offshore fisherman in the summer and a shallow water fisherman in the spring? You can do that. You can choose to do both, but what I would recommend is not try to be a shallow water and an offshore fisherman in every season. Choose to fish offshore in the summer and only fish offshore. Learn that really well, because if you try to focus on both, you're never going to learn either very well. You don't have to become an offshore fisherman all the time, but maybe you decide every season of the year, I'm going to fish shallow except during the summer, because I know the summer fishing is when it's really hot on my lake. I can catch them there. Learn the offshore fishing in June and July, and then call it a day. Go back to the bank the rest of the year if that's kind of what you enjoy. That's kind of how I recommend it. What would you think there, Randy?
Oh, I agree with that completely. And I think a lot of it also depends on what your expectations as an angler are. I mean, if you have tournament expectations or tournament aspirations, you have got to learn to fish offshore, because you're simply not going to win that many tournaments unless you get good at fishing offshore. If you fish like 1 or 2 lakes, I don't care where it is, unless you like live on the Mississippi River or the Louisiana Delta or someplace where the fish just never get deep. But if you live on a man-made impoundment and you want to fish any level of competitive fishing, whether it be a club tournament or buddy tournament or whatever, you better learn to fish offshore, because after those fish spawn and up until mid-fall, you simply can't win shallow on a man-made impoundment most of the time. So that's one aspect. But if you just are a recreational angler and you like to just go out and fish, then do what you like to do. I mean, if you enjoy figuring it out and graphing around and catching them offshore, spend your time doing that. If you like to throw a crankbait or a buzzbait at 7 o'clock in the morning, do that. Just what makes you feel good. But now it's never been a better time to learn about bass fishing than it is right now, guys. There is so much information out there at your fingertips. And I keep going back to the past, because that's just what you do when you get older, like me. So you'll do the same thing, Johnny. When you're my age, you'll start reverting back to the past. But back when I was a whippersnapper, you just did not have any access to information. The only information that you had out there was a Field and Stream magazine or Bassmaster magazine that had some outdoor writer that didn't know that much about fishing trying to tell you how to rig a plastic worm. And then none of the tournament anglers wanted to share any information. It took forever to learn anything. I mean, it took decades to what you guys can learn in one afternoon on the internet. So that's one of the things that, it's off the subject a little bit, but that's one of the things that I just don't think a lot of people realize, the transformation in the learning process here, specifically on deep water techniques. I mean, deep water bass fishing is the most complicated approach to bass fishing there is, because there's simply so many variables to it. It's something that you just can't pick up and do easy. You have to have some education. You have to have knowledge. You have to have equipment behind it. So from that standpoint, it's just really what you guys, prefer doing, but if you're going to be a well-rounded angler, you got to do both, though, because there's times you're going to get your butt kicked fishing off the bank.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, Randy. I even remember when I was growing up, when I was 12, 13 years old. I mean, that was not that long ago for me, 10 years ago, but like I remember when I would buy these DVDs. It's the Classic Patterns DVDs. You buy them in the store, and it would be like Kevin Van Dam or all these people. And there was one Classic Patterns DVD with Timmy Horton, offshore crankbait fishing. I watched that thing like 75 times because it was the only piece of information I could ever get on offshore fishing where anyone actually shared anything useful. And there's a few other like old books I have that kind of talked about offshore fishing. So I had to pull together like the scraps of information. I had every Bassmaster magazine and Bass Times back to 1992. And I would just pull them all out and I would read them over and over. And I maybe had like 5 sources of information for offshore fishing when I was learning, and then I had to learn the rest myself. There was nothing, and no one I knew around me knew how to do it either, so like I was basically screwed. So I had to learn every single inch of it, every ounce of what I learned, I had to learn on my own until I was about 18 years old. And then at that point, I knew enough to kind of know what I was doing, and so that's really the deal that that it is. It's so helpful, and I try to give as much info as I can, guys, and structure it in a way so that you don't have to do what I did. I was so frustrated growing up because I had no idea what I was doing, how to do it, and I put so many hours and blood, sweat, and tears scraping information to learn this stuff. And like I mentioned earlier, guys, if you do want to learn about some offshore fishing techniques, the basics, how to get started, head to our website, fishthemoment.com, and go to our learning plans page. It's a completely free resource where I put all of my YouTube videos. Each video here I put about 30 to 40 hours into just editing, not even including getting all the assets and the sonar recordings and all the time on the water. And I have stuff on fish finders, side imaging, down imaging, graphing, offshore bass behavior, bait selection, other just basic topics, where to fish in each season. I try to give you guys as much information as I can. Most of these are 25 to 30 minute videos, so check those out on thefishmoment.com. While you're there, if you guys are interested in getting more structured seminar content, we do these live streams where we kind of just go off the cuff, but if you want a very structured presentation with our knowledge, check out some of our virtual seminars. One we have coming up here and just next week is our Advanced Summer Jig Fishing Seminar, where Randy and I are going to be breaking down when, where, and how to catch fish offshore and up shallow on jigs in the summertime. We're talking about the best water clarity, the structure, cover, every single aspect you're going to need to know, plus some bait modifications, all these different things to catch a bunch of big fish on jigs this summer. And then we also have some recordings going up of all of our past seminars. We've been asked to do this for a while, and we kind of just been delayed on doing it, but we're finally giving all of the old seminar recordings here. So if you do have a topic that you're really interested in, like advanced offshore bass fishing, how weather affects bass, we have our pre-spawn tournament patterns here. It's a little bit past that, but it's a really good seminar as well. Now I'm going to be updating this library over the next few weeks, so definitely check back to check that out. And if you do want some help just kind of getting some spots on where to start fishing, definitely check out our lake breakdowns. We give you 40 GPS waypoints you can transfer straight to your fish finder, and they're available on lakes all across the country. Randy's doing the summer breakdowns here, and so definitely check those out. There's more coming every single week. So that is, I think, a pretty good wrap-up of the topic. I don't know if I really convinced you, Randy, to go fish up offshore, because I don't think you probably want to put 300-400 hours into it. But one thing I think could be interesting is maybe as a something in between, maybe you can teach me, we can do a video series where you teach me how to perfect a technique in the summer, this summer up shallow, and I teach you how to perfect a technique offshore. I teach you how to use the electronics, what to graph for, how to do it, maybe like a hair jig or something that you completely have no knowledge of, and I can do something that you're really good at, like flipping a big jig in shallow bushes or laydowns, whatever you do. I don't know what you do, but I think that could be a cool series to show how you teach me how to learn one technique and I can teach you the same. What do you think?
Oh, I'd be all for that, man. I'm ready to learn any secrets you want to share with that. I just get in the back of the boat and watch.
Good deal. So anything else, Randy, on this topic about the offshore fishing, making the change, anything like that?
Man, I just go back to what we started out, guys. It's just like, it depends on what you want to get out of the sport. It depends on what, your intentions are. But if you guys, and I know everybody's all over the board. Some people just want to go out and enjoy it and, eat a tuna fish sandwich and see the birds chirping. And other people may want to fish competitively, in tournaments professionally. But the more serious you are about this, as far as really, reaching your fullest potential as an angler, you're going to have to adopt the offshore fishing. I mean, you just can't, there's no other way around it. I mean, you can compete shallow. Obviously you can. I mean, I feel comfortable competing shallow, but that's something that takes decades of experience to hone your instincts as far as to be able to maximize a shallow water bite, which is much more difficult a lot of times than getting on those offshore fish. So, just decide if you want to make that commitment or not and go for it with that.
Yeah, and again, there's resources out there, guys. Really, the biggest thing is it's a commitment, because you have to build up your confidence. The confidence is literally everything in fishing, Randy. I think the mental aspect of fishing, I know you love talking about that. I love talking about it. it's way more important than knowing all the techniques, knowing all these different things. If you're confident in what you're doing, if there was a way basically where I could go to the lake and you could give me a brand new bait and you could tell me, you could instill the confidence that I was going to catch 75 pounds of bass on a bluff wall by throwing this brand new bait. If I felt confident about it, I feel like I could actually go make that happen. I would run around the lake and I would do it enough until it worked. And I feel like a lot of times that's more important than actually the fish being there or the season or anything like that. Having confidence in what you're doing can make or break a technique. What do you think about that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's so easy to get confidence in a bait if you tie on a new bait and catch fish on it. I'll tell you guys a quick story with it. This has been 15 years ago, so I wanted to learn how to fish offshore, and I wanted to become an expert at it. So, my buddy Aaron Martin said, "Man, I'll take you out. I'll show you everything I know about it." So Aaron and I went out. We spent the day graphing. That's all we did was graph. And this was back when side imaging had just came out. There wasn't even down imaging. There was side imaging. And Aaron showed me everything he knew about side imaging. And after about 6 hours, I'm just like, I said, dude, I can't fish like this. I said, I can't idle around in the middle of a cove and look for one lay down in the middle of a cove and be able to form a pattern around that. Or I can't idle in the back of this cove and look for 2 or 3 fish that are suspended out in the middle of this ditch and then expect to come back the next day in the tournament. I said, I can't fish like you do. I said, you can have it. So, it's just really on, how you like to fish,
For sure. It's kind of, Aaron can do that because he's probably done that hundreds of times like we talked about. And he's like, oh yeah, that works. I think that's one of the most underused statements. People should probably say it more. It's hard to catch other people's fish. Mm-hmm. I think there are probably a lot of guys who watch my YouTube videos and then try to go to the same spots I went to, try to catch fish off that spot. And I give the exact spots. I'm sure you can find them because I give the drone image and the navionics, and I give everything. So but it would be kind of interesting for me to hear, to find out how many people can actually go back and catch fish off the same spots I fish. Because I bet it's a very small percentage, not because they don't have the skill, but I film my videos and I might not post it for 3 weeks, and 3 weeks later, those fish are gone. And yeah, maybe if they come back in the next year in the exact same scenario, the exact week I was there with the exact same weather and water temperature and everything, they might be able to catch them. But a lot of times, they might come back next year and the lake is 3 feet high and those fish are not there at all, or they're delayed in their transition process by 3 weeks or whatever. Fishing is never the same year over year, and so it's very hard to go catch other people's fish. I mean, how many times, Randy, have you been given spots by guys to say, go fish this spot, you're going to go crush them, and then you don't catch anything? Or actually,
90% of the time,
90%?
It doesn't work, yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Oh man!
So that's one of the most difficult things you can have in fishing, for sure.
Yeah. It's very. That's why we try with our content, guys. And one thing I wanted to get your opinion on. Let me know in the comments down below. One thing I was talking about, Randy, that I think would be interesting is I'm seeing a lot of comments over here, guys, saying that there's almost information overload, which is crazy to me because when I wish there was information overload when I was learning it, and I know for you it's even more so. But one thing I was thinking about doing is putting together some lesson plans or some training programs of how you could learn how to offshore fish, or maybe do a specific technique, summer offshore fishing or summer offshore jig fishing or whatever it is, and have a very structured class where you say, take 10 weeks at the beginning of summer, get this learning plan and follow it, and you're going to be able to catch fish, but do the whole process. Let me know if you guys think that would be something that you'd be interested in, because I would love to put that together, and I feel like I'd be able to do it pretty well. And Randy can also do those as well, to say in a certain season, if you really on your lake want to learn how to catch them out of brush piles, we can make a learning plan that teaches you exactly what you need to look for, how to do it, water clarity, all the steps. And that way you don't have to watch 75 YouTube videos of guys fishing random lakes and weird stuff that they're doing, and we can help you out there. So let us know in the comments, and also over here if you think that would be interesting. What do you think about that, Randy?
Definitely so. And, when you're talking about information overload, yeah, Jonny and I give you information overload because this channel, Fish the Moment, is a hardcore hog and information channel. And so many of the other YouTube channels out there, and I'm not slamming the other channels, but a lot of them are, they're obvious promotion. And yeah, we have to plug stuff too, but a lot of them are obvious promotion. A lot of them are like, you might as well watch the Kardashians with the fishing rod in their hand because it's a reality fishing TV show. And so much of the other channels out there are production, but we give you guys hardcore hogging information. I mean, that's just what it is to it. And there's a lot of info out there to share. I mean, we could spend, the next 50 years talking about it and not cover all of it. So, we don't want to overwhelm everybody with this. So, if you have any suggestions on, things you guys want to hear about, things you want to learn, pass it on in the comment section.
For sure. And I just see guys saying there's a lot of guys pushing baits. And as you guys know, like, we talk about baits and things like that, but especially on my channel, I don't like talking about baits, and you guys don't like it obviously either, because whenever I put videos, like I just did a video last 2 weeks, Randy, where I made a video about how to pick the right lure for offshore fishing based on what you see on your fish finder, and that video got like 10,000 views, which normally my videos get like 30 or 40,000. So you guys obviously are tired of baits. I try not to focus on that because you can literally watch 75 other YouTube channels talk about baits and things like that. I try to focus more on contour maps, on bass behavior, how to read your electronics, stuff like that. That's what I find is more useful. Bait, don't get me wrong, bait things are very helpful, and especially with like Randy does with his bait modifications. That's very useful because it's like, if you're a shallow water angler, that's your advantage. Your advantage is being able to fish behind someone with a modified lure. Offshore, I don't need to worry about that as much, though I need to get better at it. But for most anglers, like by the time you get to a point where you need to start modifying your lures offshore, you're pretty dang salty at offshore fishing. So that's like the last thing you need to learn about offshore fishing. So there's a lot of good info out there, guys. I'm not saying any info is bad, and so just that's kind of my thoughts on it.
Yeah.
But cool. So that is it, guys. Really appreciate everyone tuning in. One thing we're gonna be doing, guys, is putting up this live stream on the Fish the Moment podcast. And I'm also actually going to start doing some podcast episodes, guys, where I'm going to be recapping some old Bassmaster FLW events, talking through the conditions, and kind of give you like a little history. And I'm going to be posting that onto the podcast here. I'm going to work on that project here over the next few weeks so that you guys have some stuff to listen to while you're driving to the lake, sitting at the boat ramp, at work, whatever it is. And it's going to be a little bit more of a polished podcast. I know there's a lot of podcasts out there of like, there's guys just talking about whatever, like, I don't know, the recent Bassmaster tournament, and then they start talking about their brother's, sister's basketball game or whatever. This is going to be a straight up, like, almost like a history podcast for bass fishing, but like give you all the conditions. I'm making it entertaining. It's not going to be boring. I promise I'm not going to make it boring, but I want to do something like that because I love listening to podcasts about, like, I don't know, I was listening to one the other day, Randy, about like Enron, all the scandal and the financial crisis, stuff like that. I'm a business major at my MBA. I love finance and all that stuff, and I'm like, no one does this for bass fishing. I should do it. So yeah. That's gonna be a little passion project of mine. But if you guys are wanting to check that out, go to Spotify or the Apple Podcast and subscribe to the Fish the Moment podcast. You'll find all of these upcoming live streams up there, and also all of the edited podcasts we'll be making. So just go on your phone. It helps a ton if you just download all the podcasts too. So just go to the podcast app, Spotify, Apple, download the podcast. If you are even in a better mood, leave a 5-star review. That puts us up in the search so more people find us. If you don't want to, that's fine also. But this is our thing. Throwing a lot of stuff at you guys. But anything else, Randy, before we sign off?
No, again, guys, just appreciate you taking your time out Tuesday evening to check us out. I know you guys could be doing a lot of other things, but we really appreciate you guys sharing your time with us this evening, and look forward to next Tuesday.
Good deal. Awesome. Appreciate it, Randy. We'll be back for another live stream. We'll be back with a video this Friday for the main Fish Moment channel, and Randy, you'll see him every single day on his Intuitive Angling with Randy Blockett, so check both those out. We'll see you guys next week, same time, 7 p.m. Central Standard Time on the Fish Moment Live channel. Have a great night.